Hi. If you've ever read Faulkner or Pynchon, chances are you've come across some very, very long sentences. I'm talking about the kind of stuff in Absalom, Absalom, or Gravity's Rainbow that goes on for pages and pages sometimes, while still being a grammatically correct sentence. Writers utilize this technique to induce in you, the reader, a sense of momentum. It has almost kind of a hypnotizing effect and a natural flow to it, an addictive rhythm that draws you in and doesn't let you go, especially when you read it aloud. It you get this feeling of a momentum preserved, and it keeps going. And in your writing, sometimes you want to induce this effect in your readers. Obviously, it's very situational, but sometimes you want to convey a mood or a feeling that comes with a long, unbroken passage. So how would you do that? Well, how do the writers do that? Technically, you can achieve a very long sentence with just plain adding a conjunction between complete sentences. And this is a technique called polysyndeton. And you end up with something like I walked to the store and there was a sale and I bought some apples and I paid for the apples and I went home and I ate them, etc., etc. So that's grammatically correct. This is a grammatically correct sentence, and you can make it as long as you want, but this is not very interesting, right? This is kind of, it sounds kind of manic because, you're just repeating and over again. So that's great if you want to convey that sense of mania, but you certainly wouldn't be writing lots of prose like this. It doesn't sound very natural. So what's the alternative? How do you achieve those very long sentences that have a more natural ebb and flow to them? They kind of swing back and forth, and they sound more natural. So that's where subordinate clause chaining comes in. With this technique, you can turn any sentence into a very long one, pages upon pages, and theoretically infinite. Now, before we can do that, we have to define a few terms. So, what is a clause? And this is stuff that, it's very basic. We all understand this stuff, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, a clause is it's the building blocks of a sentence, right? All of your sentences are made up of clauses. A clause is not necessarily a sentence, but a sentence is made up of one or more clauses, and it it has to have, by definition, a subject and a predicate, with a verb, your action. You can break a clause down to two types. There's an independent clause, which is something like just I walk to the store, because that's a complete sentence by itself. It stands on its own. The other is a dependent clause, where you have something like because I was out of milk, I went to the store. Because I was out of milk, this is a dependent clause because it can't stand on its own. It needs this independent clause to function as a complete sentence. And so dependent clause, they're also known as subordinate clauses. They're it's just another word. It's the same thing. And within subordinate clauses, you also have something called a prepositional relative clause. You might also hear it described as an adjective clause. It's just another word for them. It's the same thing. So let's break this down. What is a preposition? A preposition is a word like through, over, by, at, in. These are words that modify the thing after them. So, um, you know, if you have a sentence like I walked through the lawn, or I drove past the gate. Um, Through is the preposition, right? Because it comes before the thing that it's modifying. It's modifying the lawn because you're saying you are acting on the lawn somehow and you're walking through the lawn. I walked through the lawn. I drove past the gate. Past is the preposition here because it's modifying the gate. It's modifying um, what comes after it. as opposed to postpositions, right? So you've got prepositions and other languages have postpositions. Take for example a Japanese, right? They have particles which come after the thing they're modifying, so therefore they're postpositions. But in English, we're concerned with prepositions mostly, and it comes before the thing it's modifying, hence like preposition, preposition, right? So prepositions are important for these types of relative clauses because there are things where the construction is kind of like through which, you know, over which, through. I already said that. At which, stuff like that. So a full sentence would be something like the keyboard on which he is typing is dirty. On which he is typing is the relative clause in this sense, and it's got a preposition which is, or sorry, on is the preposition. So on is the preposition, and which is referring to the keyboard, right? You can break this down into two separate independent clauses. The keyboard is dirty, and he is typing on the keyboard. And that's why it's also called an adjective clause, right? Because this clause is describing the keyboard. You're saying that he is typing on this keyboard. You're giving some kind of information about the keyboard, hence adjective clause. And you can call it a relative clause as well. But the point is, you've got a preposition on inside this clause, which links it to the thing that it's modifying or describing. So with all that defined, we've got the clause, independent clause, dependent, subordinate, and a prepositional relative clause. We're in a good position to kind of start looking at the examples of how you would start chaining clauses together. But before I do that, I do need to bring up that there's the fact that a very long sentence, and this is very important because I see a lot of confusion online, especially in recent years, but a very long sentence is not necessarily a run-on, okay? And this is so important that I feel like I need to really drill this in. A very long sentence is not necessarily a run-on sentence. Um, it can be, but run-on sentences are by definition grammatically incorrect. They are independent clauses joined without any sort of conjunction or without any sort of punctuation like a semicolon or something joining them together, and that is grammatically incorrect. A very long sentence isn't necessarily a run-on. Just because a sentence is long does not make it a run-on sentence. They're two different things completely. So it's so important that I'm just going to copy and paste it over and over again. A very long sentence is not necessarily a run-on. It can be, but just the fact that it's a long sentence does not make it a run-on sentence. If we go back to our example of this polysyndeton, we could take out all these ands, and then it would become grammatically incorrect. Now it becomes a run-on sentence. Okay. And if you read this out, it's like I walked to the store, there was a sale, I bought some apples, I paid for the apples, I went home, I ate them. And that is, even though it's grammatically incorrect, it is a proper narrative device. Sometimes you do want this kind of droning, monotone construction, right? So there is a place for this as well. I mean, but this is a run-on sentence. It's a long sentence, and well, it's not really a sentence. It's a bunch of sentences connected without any sort of conjunction. So this is a run-on sentence, which is a grammatical error. But I will show you how to create very long sentences that are not run-ons and are actually grammatically correct in the next section. Let's start off with a basic sentence. Let's take something like, the cat walked across the room. It's a very simple sentence, right? It's an independent clause. It stands on its own. So we can start introducing subordinate clauses. We can start introducing more information to this sentence. We can take something like the cat. Okay, so what about the cat? Let's say the cat was adopted by some guy named Randy. Okay, the cat, which Randy had just adopted, walked across the room. And that this is, this is a sentence that you probably write on your first go, right? Like this is probably something your brain would just come up with automatically. You wouldn't have to think about it. But let's break it down, right? And what is it saying? Like what did I just do here? So I introduced this subordinate clause, and it should be able to stand on its own, right? So I should be able to rewrite this as its own independent clause. So I'm going to take what I just did, which Randy had just adopted, and I'm going to rewrite it as its own independent clause. Randy had just adopted the cat. So that's what which is referring to, right? Which is referring to the cat. So Randy had just adopted the cat, and that's a perfectly fine independent clause on its own, right? So you have to make sure that all your subordinate clauses they refer to the thing that they're supposed to refer to, right? You have to be able to take it out, and you have to be able to rewrite it essentially. So what else can we do with this? So we've got the cat, which Randy had just adopted, right? And maybe the cat is scratching Randy a bunch, right? So how do we convey that information with another subordinate clause? So we can say something like, he has to change his bandages a lot because of the cat's scratches. So how would we convey that as a subordinate clause? So the cat, which Randy had just adopted, uh, and because of whose constant scratches, he had to change out his he had to frequently change out his blood-soaked bandages and apply ointment, fresh ointment. Walked across the room. So this is a bit more complicated than the one we had just introduced first, right? But let's break it down. And you have to be able to, just like this one, you have to be able to rewrite it as its own sentence, as its own complete sentence. So what am I saying here? Because of whose. So whose, right? What is whose referring to? Whose is referring to the cat. You're saying that the cat's constant scratches are causing Randy to change out his bandages, right? So because of the cat's constant scratches, he had to frequently change out his bandages. So this one is a bit more complicated than this one, right? Because actually, when you rewrite this, you end up with a complex sentence because you've got a dependent clause here and you've got an independent clause. So it's a bit more complicated, but it's a bit more complicated, but you can see that it still stands on its own. Because of the cat's constant scratches, being Randy, right? You have to make sure all of your pronouns are referring to what they're supposed to refer to, right? Who is he? He is Randy. So because of the cat's constant scratches, Randy had to frequently change out his blah 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 blah, right? So that stands on its own. So that's your subordinate clause that you've introduced. So you still end up with your if you take them out, you still end up with your original sentence, right? The cat walked across the room. But now you're introducing more information in the form of subordinate clauses. So the cat, which Randy had just adopted, and because of who constant scratches, he had to frequently change out his blood-soaked bandages and apply fresh ointment, walked across the room. So I mean now we're cooking, right? Because let's see what we have so far. We've got put it in a new tab and as a complete paragraph. Well, it's not really a paragraph. It's a sentence, but I mean it's 30 words now, right? And we started off with 6, so I mean you've just increased it by 5 times. So what else can we do with this? Let's keep it going. Let's make it longer. And we're not going to end up with a. It's not going to be a good sentence, right? Like what I'm trying to do now is just trying to make it as long as possible. It's, you know, the it, I'm just showing you what how to you know mess with the structure so that you end up with a long sentence. I'm not. I don't think we're going to end up with a very particularly good sentence here, right? But that's a matter of style. That's a matter of style. And what we're doing right now is I just want to show you how you can achieve a sentence that you can keep going, right? And so let's, what else can we do about the sentence? So, maybe we want to convey the way the cat walked. So, how, like, what's the cat doing? The cat walked across the room. So, let's walked. That's the cat walked, its tail swaying, right? So, you should always be able to, if it gets complicated, right, you can take out these subordinate clauses and you can always work from your original sentence. The original sentence being the cat walked across the room. You can always go back to it and say, and introduce your new subordinate clause there. And obviously, and your brain can keep track of that a lot more easily, obviously, because when you're here, the cognitive load is much higher. You've got all this stuff that you got to keep track of. So if you're introducing more clauses, it's a good idea to go back to your original sentence and um, introduce your new subordinate clauses there, right? So the cat walked its tail swaying, across the room. So maybe we want to add some more information. The cat, its tail swaying, and if you're listening to this, you're a writer. You're gonna, I'm not telling you how to write, so you'll come up with your own stuff, obviously, right? Um, I'm just putting whatever on the top of my head here. Like I said, we're probably not going to end up with a very particularly good sentence. I'm just showing you the technique to prolong a sentence, so to speak. The cat walked, its tail swaying hypnotically, uh, um, undulating like a snake under a under the spell of a snake charmer. I don't know. The cat, which Randy had just abducted, and because of whose constant scratches, he had to frequently change out his blood-soaked bandages and apply fresh ointment, walked, its tail swinging hypnotically, undulating like a snake under the spell of a snake charmer, across the room. Right? So, um, let's see what we've introduced here. You have to be able to rewrite this just like you rewrote the other ones here, right? So what do we have now? We have its tail was swaying hypnotically, undulating like a snake. Its tail was swaying hypnotically. Its tail undulated like a snake under the spell of a snake charmer. I mean, that's kind of a goofy sentence, right? Like I said, I'm just doing this to show you how you would play with subordinate clauses. So now we've got a bunch of information. We've got a bunch of new information now. You've introduced these subordinate clauses to tell you how the cat walked, right? But like I said, you always have to be able to go back to the original sentence. The cat walked across the room, right? And not only do you have to be able to go back to the original sentence, you have to be able to rewrite everything as its own. You have to be able to write everything as its own independent clause. So, if we break this down, we've got many independent clauses now. We've got the cat walked across the room. You've got the cat walked across the room. Its tail was swaying hypnotically. Its tail undulated like a snake under the spell of a snake charmer. Randy had just adopted the cat. Because of the cat's constant scratches, he had to frequently change out his bandages. Right? So if you break this down, you'll end up with this, which is all of the information that this one sentence is trying to convey. The cat, which Randy had just adopted, and because of whose constant scratches, he had to frequently change out his blood-soaked bandages and apply fresh ointment. Uh, because of the cat's constant scratches, he had to apply fresh ointment. Walked, its tail swaying hypnotically. Okay, so let's keep it going. Let's make this even longer. What can we do with this? Um, it's the cat's tail was swaying, and what's the cat doing? The cat, it's let me just copy and paste a new one here, so that you can kind of see the evolution of what we've done. The cat walked, its tail swaying hypnotically, undulating like a snake under the spell of a snake charmer. It's it's looking for food, I guess, right? So um, its eyes darting across every uh, shadowy inch of its surroundings, right? So now you've got this subordinate clause, and just like the others, we're going to rewrite it as its own independent clause. So we want to see if it passes the test. Its eyes darted across every shadowy inch of its surroundings, right? It's being the cat's eyes darted across every shadowy inch of its surroundings, right? So that's fine. Um, the cat walked, its tail swaying hypnotically, undulating like a snake under the spell of a snake charmer, its eyes darting across every shadowy inch of its surroundings. So you've got the basic sentence, right? You have to be able to go back to the basic sentence being, the cat walked across the room. Um, okay, so what else can I do with this? Well, it's eyes darting across. I mean, it's probably looking for rats, right? It's a cat. It's a cat. So its eyes darting across um, every shadowy inch for a sign of its prey. For a sign, any sign of its prey, uh, which it intended to catch across the room. It's across the living room, right? Like what room are we talking about? Across the living room. Um, if it's looking for prey, it's probably stalking across. We can say the cat stalked across the room. Okay. Um, I don't know. That sounds better. So we've got its tail swaying hypnotically, its eyes darting across every shadowy inch of its surroundings for a sign, any sign of its prey, which it intended to catch. So let's break down the things that the clauses that we've introduced now. Its eyes darted across every shadowy inch of its surroundings, right? And um, the cat's eyes darted across its surroundings for a sign of its prey, right? Um, and the subordinate clause we also introduced here was which it intended to catch. So what am I trying to say here? You have to be able to rewrite this one as well, which is referring to the prey, the rats, right? So it intended to catch its prey, right? You have to be able to rewrite this. It intended to catch its prey, right? Now, what else can we do with this? Maybe what about the living room, right? Um, let's go back to Randy. Like, what's Randy doing? Randy, is it's um, it's night, right? So Randy is probably sleeping above the living room. So when we say above which Randy, across the living room, above which and Randy slept soundly, as he usually did. Um, so what is the what's the subordinate clause that we just introduced? So let's try to rewrite this one, right? So let's add it to our list of rewritten um, complete sentences. So above which Randy slept soundly as he usually did. So if we write this, it would be Randy slept soundly as he usually did above the living room, right? You've got which is referring to the living room, and above, you've got the preposition here, above which Randy slept soundly. So if you rewrite it, it'd be Randy slept soundly above the living room, as he usually did. Okay, so um, what what else can we do? Um, we can say that you know, so Randy is sleeping above the living room. What about the rats that the cat is looking for, right? The cats are looking for the cat is looking for the rats. So maybe the rats are hiding in the walls. So we would say, okay, what if we have another preposition? Um, so the rats are living in the walls. So beyond beyond whose walls the rats huddled together in fear of that skulking creature looking for them. Okay, so what have I just done? I've introduced this subordinate clause now, and let's rewrite this like we did with all the other ones. Beyond whose walls the rats huddled. How would I rewrite this as its own sentence? So beyond whose walls. Um, so the rats huddled together in fear of that skulking creature. So the rats huddled together beyond the living room walls. So beyond the living room's walls, the rats huddled together in fear of that creature looking for them, right? So if you break it down, like I said, all of these have to function as their own sentences. So we've got a very long sentence now, and we've got all the information that it's trying to convey. So what else? Let's keep it going. So we've got um, across the living room, above which Randy slept soundly, as he usually did, and beyond whose walls. So we're really saying, you know, the cat stalked across the living room, beyond whose walls the rats huddled together in fear of that skulking creature looking for them. And what if we kept this going? We can say, the cat's pretty much tormenting the lives of these rats, right? So you can say the presence of which had tormented their very existences ever since the cat's arrival. See, I mean, now we're getting really contrived, right? Like you probably wouldn't write a sentence like this, but like I said, I'm just we're demonstrating how, if you wanted to write a very long sentence, and like they said, like they say that the first draft is always, it's the first draft is always poop, right? Like, and we're not even this isn't even a first draft. Like this is like something below a first draft because I'm just kind of making this up as I go along, right? So obviously you're gonna refine this, but you know this is to show you what structure you can kind of what kind of structure you can build off just chaining subordinate clauses together. So the presence of which had tormented their very existences since the cat's arrival. So let's rewrite this one just like we do with all the other subordinate clauses. The presence of which, what is which? Which is referring to the cat, right? The cat, because we're chaining it with this. We're chaining it to in fear of that skulking creature looking for them. You're chaining it to the skulking creature looking for them. The presence of so it's not even the cat, it's the presence of that skulking creature um, looking for them had tormented their very existences ever since the cat's arrival. So that's your rewritten complete sentence. The presence of which had tormented their very existences ever since the cat's arrival. Um, yeah, let's keep it going. So what other information can we add to this? The cat's arrival, you know, the cat's arrival was an event, right, that affected the lives of those rats. I mean, we're getting kind of redundant now, but like I said, this is completely illustrative. It's just an example of how you can chain together a bunch of subordinate clauses, the presence of which had tormented their very existences ever since the cat's arrival. Um, the event of wit, or no, I don't want to do that. The event of the cat's arrival, ever since the cat's arrival, an event which an event that signaled a turning point for the rats whose daily lives had been ruined, completely upended, let's say. So with this subordinate clause that we've introduced, let's add it to the list, right? Let's add it to the list of complete sentences. So an event, we're saying, so if you look at this, we're saying really, I'm going to add it in square parentheses, okay, square brackets, because you're really saying which was an event, right? The cat's arrival, ever since the cat's arrival, which was an event, but you can take out the which was, right? So that's why I'm putting it in square brackets, because you can kind of leave this out, and it's implied. So the cat's arrival was an event that signaled a turning point for the rats. And really, I've got another subordinate clause here, right? So let's add that one to the list as well. Okay, so now we've got the cat's arrival was an event that signaled a turning point for the lives of for the rats. The rats' daily lives had been completely upended, right? So we're able to rewrite them all as their own complete sentences. So these are good. They pass the test. The presence of which had tormented their very existences ever since the cat's arrival, an event that signaled a turning point for the rats, whose daily lives had been completely upended, who and whose bloodlines were soon to end because of the cat, whose bloodlines were at an end, would soon and whose bloodlines would soon come to an end thanks to the presence of the cat. Yeah, like I said, we're getting really contrived now. Like this is, I mean, you would never. This is a very strange sentence, right? And I'm just doing this for the sake of. I've mentioned that many times by now. I'm just doing this for the sake of illustration. Whose bloodlines would soon come to an end thanks to the presence of the cat, who had taken it upon itself to vanquish those filthy rats once and for all. Okay. Uh, let's update our list properly. The rat's daily lives had been completely upended, and we introduced this, um, and whose bloodlines would soon come to an end thanks to the presence of the cat. Um, the rats. Okay. Whose bloodlines? Whose bloodlines? The rat's bloodlines. So the rat's bloodlines would soon come to an end thanks to the presence of the cat. And I also introduced this one, who had taken it upon itself to vanquish those filthy rats. So you can see, you know, uh, after living room, I start. It's really obvious that I'm just chaining all these subordinate clauses together, right? After living room, you've got above which Randy slept soundly, right? And then beyond whose walls. So you can here's where I'm chaining them. Above which and beyond whose, the presence of which, um, and then which was an event, and whose daily lives, and whose bloodlines, and who had taken it upon, right? So after living room, it's very obvious these subordinate clause chaining. You can really see where it starts to take effect. So the rad's daily lives have been completely upended. The rad's bloodlines would soon come to an end thanks to the presence of the cat. And then lastly, this one, who had taken it upon itself to vanquish those filthy rats once and for all? Who? Who's referring to? What is who referring to? The who is referring to the cat. The cat had taken it upon itself to vanquish those filthy rats once and for all. And this is very long now, but we can still keep it going, right? We can say that. Um, so what happens after the cat vanquishes these rats? Well, Randy is probably pretty happy because the rats in his house are gone. So who had taken it upon itself to vanquish those filthy rats once for all? So we're going to say that the act of the vanquishing of those rats make Randy happy. So we can say the destructive act of which would would please its owner, would please Randy, would please its owner, Randy. Oh, wait, I don't want to end this sentence yet. Let's take out that full stop. So I've got the destructive act of which would please its owner. So can I write that as its own complete sentence? The destructive act of which. What is of which referring to? Of which is referring to the act of vanquishing those rats. So this is a bit more complicated, right? But I can still rewrite this. The destructive act of vanquishing the rats would please its owner, would please Randy, right? So let's see. The rat's bloodlines would soon come to the end, thanks to the presence of the cat. The cat had taken it upon itself to vanquish those filthy rats once and for all. The destructive act of the the rats vanquishing would please Randy. Yeah. Um, who who had Randy had enough of these rats, right? So of Randy, who had had enough of the pests living in his house. So obviously you want to rewrite this one as well, right? So Randy had had enough of the pests living in his house, right? Um, and you kind of get the idea, right? I'm just adding subordinate clauses for the sake of adding subordinate clauses. Now this is a very strange sentence, but it's all one sentence. It's still one sentence, right? And you know, it's all grammatically correct. Like this is not a run-on sentence. A very long sentence is not necessarily a run-on sentence. A run-on sentence is just it's different. A run-on sentence is grammatically incorrect. But this is all grammatically correct, right? Because all of these subordinate clauses, I've showed you that they can be written as um, their own complete sentences. And you can have an infinite amount of subordinate clauses, and it's still not a run-on sentence if it's grammatically correct. Um, it's just your reader is probably going to lose their mind if you keep it going, right? But like I said, this is just to illustrate the fact that you can keep a sentence going forever. You can keep it going as long as you chain together subordinate clauses. You can keep this going for the rest of time, right? I'm sure there's somebody who could write a computer program to keep chaining um, these subordinate clauses for the rest of time until you know uh, until um, the entropy of the universe reaches its maximum, right? Okay, so let's just add one more for good measure because I think I've kind of I think it's kind of clear how to I've demonstrated enough is what I'm trying to say. So and who had adopt so Randy had adopted this cat for the sole sake of getting rid of his rats, and who had adopted the cat in hopes that it would uh, eradicate every single one of those furry bastards. Okay, who had adopted the cat in hopes that it would you know fulfill its primal urges and eradicate every single one of those filthy animals. So let's rewrite this one because you have to be able to rewrite this as its own complete sentence. Who had adopted the cat? Who am I talking about? I'm talking about Randy. So the who is referring to Randy. Randy had adopted the cats in hope that it would fulfill its primal urges and eradicate every single one of those furry bastards. Okay, so we've got a pretty long sentence now, right? So, uh, you know, let's take this and see what we have. Let's get rid of all these line breaks, and you can still go back to the original sentence. The original sentence is the cat stalked across the living room, right? You have to be able to go back to your original sentence at any time. So let's get rid of all these line feeds and get rid of this which was. So we've got 200 words. Okay, we started off with 6 words. We started off with the cat walked across the room, right? The original sentence was the cat walked across the room. Okay, we went from 6 words to 201 words. And we did this by chaining together subordinate clauses. And now you've got a really, really long sentence, which is, like I said, your reader is going to lose their mind trying to parse all this. But now you've got a long sentence. So how did we do this? We did it by chaining a bunch of subordinate clauses together, each one of which can be written as its own complete sentence, right? We've got this list of complete sentences that make up this very long sentence. You break this long sentence down, and you've got a bunch of complete sentences that convey the information of this sentence. So let's read out this whopper of a sentence. The cat, which Randy had just adopted, and because of whose constant scratches he had to frequently change out his blood-soaked bandages and apply fresh ointment, stalked, its tail swaying hypnotically, undulating like a snake under the spell of a snake charmer, its eyes darting across every shadowy inch of its surroundings for any sign of its prey, which it intended to catch, across the living room, above which Randy slept soundly, as he usually did, and beyond whose walls the rats huddled together in fear of that skulking creature looking for them. the presence of which had tormented their very existences ever since the cat's arrival, an event that signaled a turning point for the rats, whose daily lives had been completely upended, and whose bloodlines would soon come to an end, thanks to the presence of that cat, who had taken it upon itself to vanquish those filthy rats once and for all, the destructive act of which would please its owner, Randy, who had had enough of the pests living in its house, and who had adopted the cat in hopes that it would fulfill its primal urges and eradicate every single one of those furry bastards. For good. Yeah, so that's a very long sentence because we've just turned the cat stalked across the living room into this grammatically correct, I must point out, very long sentence, which is not a run on sentence. Closing thoughts, takeaways, and pitfalls. Number one, this is just a tool. The point of this video is not to say that every single one of your sentences has to be some 800-word monstrosity. That's not what I want you to take away from this. But chaining together subordinate clauses to lengthen a sentence should be a tool in your toolbox. Every writer should be capable of writing in ways they will never actually end up using in practice. Which is to say, don't just forcibly shove subordinate clauses at every possible opportunity for the sake of shoving as many subordinate clauses as you possibly can into a text. Note that there wasn't any kind of editing or refining going on today. We just kind of vomited something out, right? Like I said, it was basically less than a first draft. And a first draft even is probably only like 10% of a finished product. There's editing and rewriting and refining, and that's just a whole different entire ball game. It's way beyond the scope of this hour-long YouTube video. And it's especially hard in this particular case because I don't think we could go back and refine what I wrote because there's nothing of substance there. We weren't really writing about anything. So again, and this is the last time I'll mention this, but it was a illustrative example of a structure. The only thing that I'm teaching here is the possible syntax and construction of subordinate clauses. Number two, respect the full stop. That's a little dramatic, but a period has an associated cost. Every period you come across is a subconscious signal to your reader's brain that they should stop. I mean, it's called a full stop for a reason. Your brain consciously, or rather subconsciously, will take a full stop as a termination because that's the role it serves. It terminates a sentence. So you have to respect the scope of a sentence, and this is something you have to develop a feel for, but a sentence should encompass a certain amount of information. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that every sentence should contain the same amount of information because that's ridiculous, but be aware of how much you're actually saying with a sentence because it should be at least somewhat substantial. Not to say that there aren't short sentences, because of course there are, but again, when you're writing, you have to be aware of how you're using a sentence to convey your thoughts. Because a sentence, like I said, when you read it, it tells your brain, hey, stop. Stop and process what you've just read. It interrupts a flow, and and for good reason. It lets you process what you've just read. You know, if you've ever really noticed it, if you've ever really stopped and noticed, every word you read, the reader you're already coming up with the rest of a sentence for everything you're reading. So when you're reading a sentence, your brain is already filling in the blanks with what it expects, even if it doesn't know all the words that are coming up. It's already kind of reading ahead with a rhythm that it has that it's expecting. It has an expectation of how the sentence will sound. There's an internal rhythm that it wants resolved, basically. It wants that rhythmic expectation to be fulfilled and to be satisfied. There's a natural flow when you're reading because why do we read the words that why do we write the words that we do? Why do we talk in the rhythm that we do? It's all part of our brain. It's all part of our brain's natural rhythm or cadence because even without words, it still exists. If you've spent any serious amount of time writing, then you know what I'm talking about, right? But even if you don't know what I'm talking about, I can kind of show you what that expectation is. Okay, so just listen to this. If I say something like, once upon a time in a land far, far away, your brain is already filling in the rest of that sentence, even though it doesn't really know what I'm about to say, because it's such a stock phrase. It's such a common stock phrase that you've already heard countless examples of what follows it, right? Once upon a time in a land far, far away, there was a princess in some kingdom, da 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 da, right? You've already got that rhythmic expectation that it wants fulfilled. So sometimes when that comes up, you don't want to interrupt that natural rhythm that your reader's brain is expecting with a full stop. You want to keep it going. And that's where, a complicated sentence can play a role. And again, you don't want to pad out things for the sake of padding it out, but it's all about fulfilling the rhythmic expectation that your brain is expecting in certain cases. And sometimes you need to preserve that momentum. You need to keep a sentence going. And that's where subordinate clauses can come in. Moving on to the next topic, number 3, the last point, watch out for dangling modifiers. So a dangling modifier is when the thing you're intending to modify is unclear, it's ambiguous. So in a clause, any clause, the subject and predicate need to be unambiguous. You always need to be clear what you're referring to in a clause. So I can give you examples, and these are bad, right? These are examples of what not to do. Example, something like driving his car up the hill, the house came into view. And maybe that sounds okay at first listen or at first reading. You're, it sounds okay to your ear. Driving his car up the hill, the house came into view. But if you stop to think about this sentence kind of falls apart. I mean, this is an example of a dangling modifier. You always have to be aware of your subject and your predicates, right? The house came into view is an independent clause, and that's fine because the house is your subject and came is your predicate. But this part is a dependent clause, and it needs a subject too. So what is the subject here? The house? Well, it can't be. I mean, the house is not driving a car up a hill, right? And one way to detect dangling modifiers very easily is reordering the sentence. So if we rewrite this sentence the way we kind of rewrite the way that we kind of rewrote everything back in the previous section, you can see that this just falls apart when you reorder it this way. The house driving his car up the hill came into view. I mean, it's the same sentence as this, but you've reordered it in a different way. And by reordering it, it's very clear that this is just a garbage sentence. Like this is nonsense. This is complete nonsense. So that's a good way of finding dangling modifiers. You want to watch out for these because when you're writing very complicated sentences, you can potentially fall into the trap of losing sight of the subject and the predicate for each subordinate clause you're introducing because you're introducing so many of them. But no matter how many you introduce, you always have to keep track of your subjects and your predicates, right? You want to avoid the problem of dangling modifiers. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that you need to always be asking what is your intended subject and what is the verb, what is the predicate? Because that's the reason why we were constantly rewriting our subordinate clauses as independent clauses back in the previous section. There's a reason why we kept doing that. Because you've heard the phrase writing is rewriting, and yes, they're right, but when they say that, they're usually referring to editing, to refining an existing sentence. But I would argue that there's just as important a part of rewriting your sentences, even if you don't use them, right? Even if they end up not in the final text, that you should rewrite them and look at them from a different angle. Look at things from a different perspective. It's similar to what artists, and I'm talking about illustrators or people who draw, and the way they flip images, they mirror images and look at what they're drawing from a different angle. Because when you're drawing from the same angle, you kind of get locked in, and any glaring errors you don't notice until you look at them from a different perspective, right? You can mirror the image or you can flip it upside down, and it becomes very obvious if you're making a mistake because you're looking at things from a different perspective. And I would argue that you should be doing the same thing with your writing, because look at how we discovered an error here. Because this thing, even though to your ear it might sound good, it becomes a completely stupid sentence when you reorder it and look at it from a different perspective. So you need to, like I said, the point is to always be certain and unambiguous in your subjects and your predicates in your dependent clauses. So just like artists do, change the order around, look at it from a different angle, look at it from a different perspective. Can the relative clauses be written as independent clauses? Because they have to be. They always have to be. Just like in the previous section where we took each subordinate clause and rewrote it as their own independent clause. You always have to be able to do that and have a clear subject and a predicate. So for each clause, think about who or what is doing the action and think about, have you made that clear enough? Because it always has to be clear. So what was the point of all this? Why make this video? I'm a writer myself. Why am I giving out this knowledge? Well, I want to foster self-expression for writers. I want to give you possible tools for you to express yourself. It's always good to have more options. And also, on a more selfish note, I also want to be able to read more complicated prose. And I don't think I'm alone in this, but I, I feel like these kind of complicated constructions are becoming more rare these days. I just don't, and maybe that's my problem. Maybe I'm not looking in the right places. But when you're reading something like Gravity's Rainbow, you end up getting lost in the prose. You spend a lot of effort unraveling the prose, and you get lost in it, right? It creates a kind of immersion. It induces a kind of flow state where there's just nothing except you and the prose that you're reading. And I don't see that so often these days. And maybe, again, maybe I'm wrong and maybe I'm just ignorant. So maybe I'm missing out on some real uh, literary bangers. And, if so, maybe leave some recommendations in the comments, because um, maybe I'm at fault here. But personally speaking, I've used this technique in my own personal writing, and I think it can be effective if used correctly. If you want to see how I personally have incorporated it as part of a narrative, you can check out the link in the description below. You can check it out and you can see some real practical examples of subordinate clause chaining that's not as contrived as, what we came up with in the last section, which was kind of just off the cuff, right? That wasn't really anything real. So if you want real examples, then you can follow the link and see how I've done it in a proper narrative. But that's all I wanted to talk about, and hopefully you've learned something from this. Let me know your thoughts. If you think I'm way off, let me know. I don't really even know if there's an audience for this kind of thing, because I haven't seen anyone talk about this on this site, and maybe that's for good reason. Maybe this is like completely obsolete, and it doesn't have any place in the modern state of literature. But or maybe this is just so obvious that there was never needed to be any videos made about it. But yeah. Let me know your thoughts, and that's all I have for you. Thank you.